Today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices. Visit rockauto.com and tell them that Locked On sent you. And of course, we've got a great episode coming up for you today as we break down the Brooklyn Nets loss at the hands of the Chicago Bulls. What did we take away from some of the inside the game momentum swings? Where was Kevin Durant's game, James Harden, and of course, the supporting cast? Lots to dive into. We're going to cover it all, including some adjustments from Steve Nash throughout the course of this game and what felt like maybe opportunities to expose or attack Chicago in a couple of different directions. Instead, it's a 118-95 loss, and we're going to dive into all of it right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am, of course, your host, Adam Armbrecht, flying solo at Adam Armbrecht over on Twitter and also covering the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast. Doug Norrie, evening off, blue check mark. And if you're looking for those DFS daily fantasy needs, you know he's got you covered over at DFSR for the full spectrum of sports. But in the meantime, let's get into this game. The Brooklyn Nets, as we said there at the top, losing on the road to Chicago. This is, of course, the back-to-back. This is, of course, the third game in 4 nights and coming off a 5-game win streak. So I think by the end of this one, what we thought was going to play out did. Fatigue factor didn't quite have the legs there, and a game that the Nets were leading at half and really were right there all the way through the third quarter. As the fourth quarter got underway, it just started to slip away from them a little bit. But there's things inside of this one to break down, obviously. And I think some common themes that we've talked about over the last handful of episodes that we want to make sure that we touch back in on, because it's until we get to, I think Doug and I have said this, right? We did a little victory lap on the 5 to 7 games before you knew whether or not you needed to be worried about James Harden. We said you shouldn't be, and it looks like you shouldn't be. And this was another good example of it. He wasn't quite James Harden, that is, as downhill attacking in this one, leaned into a little bit more of the facilitator mentality early in this one, but the overall game is there. And again, another common theme we're going to get to is you saw in this one early in the first and second quarter, some of the calls that were or were not coming James Harden way. We're now at the point where the entire Brooklyn Nets team on the court, the bench, Steve Nash. I mean, it's almost a comical situation when some of these calls don't happen. And Ryan Rucco and Sarah Kustok on the call tonight, if you're watching the TV broadcast, they brought up, got to remember, and this may be, a little nuance to the piece. James Harden's left-handed, so sometimes what can look like when we talk about, trying to swing your arm through, trying to hook and get yourself past the defender, sometimes it can look a little bit different depending on where you are as a referee and also for a defender. Doug brought this up on the last episode about how you get used to certain things, right? We were talking about Kevin Durant's jump shot and his motion and the fact that Doug was saying he kind of brings it up a little bit to the side. So for a defender, or it should be on the right side, I'm left-handed if you're watching visually on YouTube. So when you look, though, if you're a defender in the NBA, it's even more difficult to defend against Kevin Durant because you're so used to defending the typical motion, the typical shot. And then you add in that Kevin Durant's one of the best players in the league. And then you add in that he's also one of the most proficient shooters when you talk about the height, the length, the ability to rise up over top, get to a spot, etc. In the same way, I think sometimes it can be, and this we talk about this with the elite talents in the NBA, there's a threshold, and we certainly don't want it to swing on the side of every star gets every call whenever they want it. And you can use James Harden as the poster child for that, right? Just because you're going through the motions of being in the lane doesn't mean you're automatically being fouled. However, the other side of that is just because you're an elite talent doesn't mean that you're not being fouled in some of these circumstances. So the nuance continues inside of that element of the game, and that's all right. You can live with that piece of it. I do think it'll be interesting to see again active conversations throughout this game with James Harden. He went essentially from the first half carrying over the second half, having these conversations with the refs. You see a lot of the diagramming of the play. If I'm doing this, if I go up in this way, the defender is here. Are we talking foul? Am I going to the line? Am I not? Because as we've said throughout this, James Harden's going to adjust to what the new order is in the league, but he still is going to need clarification along the way. And I certainly thought there were points in this game where it got chippy enough in the first half and there was frustration enough, really a little bit on both sides, that you maybe thought a tech was going to come for somebody here in this one. That being the case, though, as I say, continuing to round himself into form when you talk about 4 of 11 from the field, 3 of 7 from beyond the arc. So the numbers are roughly there. Again, only 3 trips to the line. So that's not enough for you, but gave you 14 points, gave you the 8 rebounds, the 5 assists. Again, 4 turnovers. So there's some sloppiness in there as well. But I think you can still chalk this up as to being a relatively positive night out for James Harden. And it's just the fatigue factor for the team overall that really cost them down the stretch in this one. Now, the other side of this conversation is the thing that Doug and I have talked about and said, taking for granted the Kevin Durant the quality of his game. Right now, Steve Nash did some interesting things here. He tried to, I think, spread out these minutes a little bit and balance the books. The Nets actually started the fourth quarter of this one without either Harden or Kevin Durant on the floor. Only lasted about 2 minutes, but you could see this was all a part of that process of how do we get from the start of this game all the way through the fourth quarter with a chance to have enough healthy, energetic legs on the court to try to pull this one out. So only 17 minutes for Kevin Durant in the first half, still gave you 15 points. He ends up going the full third quarter in this one. And by the end of it, even though they pull him out there, the starters around, I think the 2 or 3 minute mark here in the fourth quarter as it started to get away from him, still ends up going 35. Right. So the balance there, yes, but also Kevin Durant wants to be on the court. Said it last episode about where this guy is at. And just like James Harden having these conversations with the referees, talking about where are these foul calls, what's the game. You don't even see there's a frustration there, but there's also just I want to be in these conversations with referees. I want to be talking to DeMar DeRozan in between plays, right? I want to be chirping with uh, guests, fans on the sidelines that are saying whether or not it was or was not a foul, and Durant answering with them. He's fully engrossed in the process of playing NBA basketball. So you know that even when you want to protect these guys against themselves a little bit in these situations, as long as this one was within earshot, they were going to try to keep pushing the envelope and keep themselves out there. 35 minutes, 13 to 24 from the field, 9 to 9, got to the stripe with regularity in this one and ends up putting up a big 38-point performance. But the biggest takeaway here in this one, I think, after you remind yourself how good Kevin Durant is, late in the fourth quarter, scrapping, working through traffic, goes down looking for a loose ball and really fully extends. It's that play where you're reaching out for a ball on the court and everything up your side into the armpit and the arm becomes fully flat against the court. So a little hyperextension there. He gets up, reaching for it, feeling at it, takes a minute to get up on the court there, stays in the game, but it'll be something to monitor. They're in the middle of a 6-game road trip. I don't know what version of rest regiment the Brooklyn Nets are going to try to massage into this. But as we move through the next couple of days, I'm sure we'll hear post-game takeaways, etc., and kind of find out the state of Kevin Durant's shoulder. But that's one of those things in a game like this when, listen, if you're within 10 points, even with 2 minutes to go, it's not out of reach for Kevin Durant and James Harden, right? And yet you could see the direction this thing was going, and you want to safeguard yourself against it, right? Save them from themselves at some point. Uh, And so, listen, hopefully he comes out of that all right. But it's just one of those things that you can't protect players against themselves in terms of a game to game base. You got 82 of these things. If that was the case, you'd say, don't start Kevin Durant, never play him. But he has to be out there on the court. He's looking to make plays as everybody was in this one. And again, it's just a reminder. 3 of 8 from downtown, by the way, on his night as well. But just a reminder that Delicate is the balance of success for the Brooklyn Nets, right? We've talked about this throughout the start of this season. We mentioned on the last episode about Kevin Durant maybe finally being fully healthy and back as you reach that Milwaukee Bucks series in the playoffs last year. And now this season, even more so with James Harden recovering from his injury, with no Kyrie Irving, we know how important and crucial Kevin Durant is, not just for the postseason. It actually matters even more now for the regular season with the way we see the Eastern Conference shaping up. The Chicago Bulls being one of those teams that you just flat out have to watch for. You have to respect. They added some nice pieces in the offseason, DeMar DeRozan being key among them. It's not going to be an easy road. We highlighted this a few episodes ago, and I think it's going to be a theme throughout the early stages of this season. We're going to get into some of the things that the Brooklyn Nets did to start this game. There were there were stretches of this game that looked like just great basketball, really both ways, and some areas of emphasis maybe on either side. And then it got a bit messy for a while there. So we'll break down some of those looks and what we thought, and then get into also the rotation, the supporting cast piece, another big performance in here from LaMarcus Aldridge, and kind of balancing the books though, as we've talked about before, minute shares, some of the veteran players, and where you set those expectations as far as consistency on a night in and night out basis. First, though, of course, we got to tell you about our friends over at Truebill. You know why free trials renew without your consent? It's because it's a business scam to get money out of you. That's the deal. Don't let greedy corporations pocket your money. Download Truebill and take control of your subscriptions. Truebill is the new app that helps you identify and stop paying subscriptions that you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. Trust me, friends, I have more subscriptions to more things that I don't know that I'm paying for, but I'm not going to have them any longer once I get myself on Truebill. On average, by the way, people save up to $720 a year by using Truebill. Because companies make subscriptions hard to cancel, Truebill makes it incredibly simple. Just link your accounts and Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscription in one tap. And now, of course, Truebill has over 2 million users that have helped save them over $100 million. Good Lord. Again, my girlfriend literally found out that she had subscriptions to the same service that she was paying two bills on two separate accounts. Lickety split, just like that. It's taken care of. It's nobody's fault. A lot of things are going on, bells and whistles, apps, subscriptions. You get caught up in the ambrosia of all the entertainment. But here's the way that you make sure you get yourself back on track and get some money back in your pocket. Don't fall to subscription scams anymore. Start canceling today at truebill.com/locked on NBA. And of course, as Doug has been telling you on the podcast recently, if you're an NBA fanatic, then you have to be in on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is a daily fantasy made easy for you, my friends. If you have not checked it out yet, you're missing out. I'll give you a reason why as we walk over to that little app. Go search for it, pull it up, and you're going to see that Prize Picks has the best NBA DFS prop games in the market. Prize Picks gives you more NBA props than any other DFS prop operator and offers all the superstar players as well as bench players, only recording a handful of minutes in each game. The bottom line is that Prize Picks allows you to have mixed sports entries. You can take over on LeBron combined with the under on Mahomes in the same entry. So if you have your superstar talents, your favorite teams, let's go with Kevin Durant. Let's go with Danny Dimes of the New York Football Giants, if you still believe in them. Maybe a little bit of Kadarius Toney action along the way as well. If you think they got those right matchups, go ahead. Link them together. You can form a prop bet that way, crossing over the sports landscapes. Use the award-winning app on both the App Store and on Google Play. Entries can be made in under 60 seconds. It's that easy. Don't hesitate. Check out prizepicks.com and use promo code NBA, or go to the App Store and download the app today. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. I love it, and I know you're going to enjoy yourself too. So, one more element that I want to get to on James Harden before we move into kind of a little bit of the game strip, some things that the Nets had to adjust to early in this one. They did make some changes going into the second half, but ultimately, Chicago did a nice job counteracting that as well. So this was a game, again, between the script, the fatigue, all those elements. You do just tip your hat to Chicago, say it's a good win. They get off the 2-game snide, and you move on to the next matchup. But One thing I didn't bring up when we talk about James Harden, and I specifically made notes about this early in the game because we've highlighted Kevin Durant's focus on both ends of the floor to start the season. We know what his offensive game is going to be, but we've also felt like he's been pretty dialed in on the defensive end, looking to make an impact on both ends of the court. Now, James Harden, though, I have these noted down here. He had as a passer first, right? But active in the lane, in the defensive lanes, active in the passing lane. So specifically on the defensive end, not even worrying about what he's doing offensively. He denied a pass in the paint early in this one. He broke up a cross court pass, tipped it out of bounds, had a block late on a perimeter 3-point shot with the shot clock winding down, and also battled Green on a rebound. I think late in the third quarter, giving the Nets a chance and opportunity. Bounce off his hands, goes out of bounds. Those were a number of probably things that don't come up in the stat sheet because they're not going to be considered steals, right? The block will get accounted for, but these aren't direct steals. But active on the back end, active in the passing lanes. And I think, again, one of those things that we look over when it comes to Kevin Durant's game as far as what he's capable of doing on the defensive end. Likewise for James Harden. We've talked about this before when it comes to the best talents in the league. Nothing about the NBA is about being one of the best players in the league and being defensive minded, right? Very few players are doing it on both ends of the floor with consistency. Think about Kawhi Leonard when healthy, right? Being locked down on the defensive end and then obviously being a very methodical player on the offensive end. However, typically it's also the case that it's not necessarily about ability, it's about effort on the defensive end. And in this particular game, I really thought that Harden, when we talk about him being healthy and getting himself into a rhythm, you take into account both ends of the floor. And I really liked what he was doing on the defensive end. So that'll be something to keep an eye on as well, especially in the absence of Kyrie Irving. We said this last year about his game. While not maybe the highest rated defender at his position, when he gives maximum effort, you saw how he was capable of really impacting shots and affecting some of the better shooters on the opposition. So now, in the absence of Kyrie Irving, you know that you have players like Bruce Brown, Bembry, who we're going to get to in the third segment of this one, talking about the supporting cast, defensive minded players that can get some of this work done for you. But you do need it does start at the top, right? That message gets sent down from the best players to the back end of the bench. And Harden did a really good job in this one. So I want to make sure we give the tip of the cap, just in case Harden listening to the show, obviously. On the game script side of things, before we do get into some other elements of it. So this one gets sloppy, by the way. The second quarter is and sloppy maybe the wrong word because it's a mix of chippy. Both sides are getting frustrated. We know the piece around how the foul calls are going to go, but the second quarter was a little bit muddled. And then the third quarter cleaned right back up. Fourth quarter gets away from the Nets, as we said. But early in this one, there was a couple of things that I thought was pretty interesting. The Brooklyn Nets come out and essentially being one of the better rated defensive teams in spite of losing the offensive rebound battle and second chance opportunities, certainly, but they are rated as one of the better defensive teams in the league. And yet, early in this one, against a team in the Chicago Bulls who doesn't have a ton of size, doesn't have a ton of length to really worry about, you actually really it seemed like we're concerned about spacing and watching for those perimeter shots, which I can appreciate. However, in lieu of that, what you ended up giving them was just beautiful access into the paint. At one point in this contest, it was 40-11 in favor of the Chicago Bulls, points in the paint. Now, the Nets cleaned that up based on halftime adjustments, but it was an interesting approach to this one because when you look across the roster, you think about DeRozan, veteran player. He had a nice game for himself and led the team along with Zach LaVine. But if you think about two players that are going to get theirs, then you think about mitigating some of the other opportunities for them. Vucevic, who's had a bad start to the season, feels like you're going to be able to live with Blake Griffin on him, live with LMA when he's in there, throw a little Bruce Brown action at him whenever you want to. But he's not exactly a threat that you need to account for. So then when you think about the guards, when you think about the small forwards, you think about how are we going to keep them out of the paint and off the glass? So a little more congestion early seems like it would have been phase one. Phase two would be seeing if you can knock down the perimeter shots and going from there. Ironically, in this one, the Nets allowed the lane access early. Didn't the 3-point shooting was not there for Chicago. Shot just 17% through the first half of this one. Ended up turning around the second half And in the second half, the adjustment that got made was let's congest the lane, let's deny the access, and let's force Chicago to work around the perimeter and see if they're capable of knocking down some of these perimeter looks. Because ultimately, as you sag into the paint, we talked about this from a Brooklyn Nets standpoint, right? Penetration and dish. If you can get into the lane and start to suck in that defense, all of a sudden those looks on the outside are going to be wide open for you to knock down if you're capable of. And the Chicago Bulls in the second half were capable of it. But I would have gone the reverse route on this. I would have started by saying, let's not allow Levine and DeRozan and Ball and the Chicago Bulls to get into the paint and to get at the basket. Let's congest things early and then worry about expanding our defense out to the perimeter later on. The Chicago Bulls, who ended up shooting 29% from the field, cleaned it up in the second half. But it's far easier to expand out if you're the Brooklyn Nets. If you struggle with second chance opportunities, far easier to extend your defense out as opposed to pull it back in, because as you start to then sag back in, those looks do become wide open, and something that Chicago was struggling with early in the game, they start to have a little bit more success with. Another theme that goes back to last season, Kevin Durant talked about in one of the post-game press conferences early this year, is the number of shots. Nets put up 86. Chicago puts up 98, plus 12 and just opportunities. You think about where they were at the, I want to make sure we get the free throws in here too. 19 to 20 in favor of Chicago, 16 to 19, 17 to 20. So that's a non-factor in this game as far as it goes. You also know that from a turnover standpoint, 15 to 9. Nets continue to be a little bit sloppy at times. It's something that you live with from the superstars, that you get frustrated with from the supporting cast. But 12 more shots on volume alone, it's going to at times keep you in a game that maybe you're falling out of. And then in a game that you're leading, every second chance opportunity is another opportunity to say, well, we had a 7-point lead, we push it to 10. We get a putback, we take it from 7 to 9, from 11 to 13, right? And then at the other end, combine it with those turnover factors, all of a sudden you find a game slipping away when, again, you're fatigued. But it's a theme. The Brooklyn Nets should not be getting outshot by that disparity on a night in, night out basis. And it happened a lot last year, continues to happen this year. And I do wonder what adjustments the Nets will try to make. Listen, it's gang rebounding. We know what they were predicated on. This idea that, well, we'll just outshoot you at a higher percentage and you won't be able to catch up with us ultimately. The problem is, without Kyrie Irving now, do you have enough firepower to do that? Do you have enough firepower to hang your hat on it? Now, the defensive piece of this does not go without saying, because if you can, in a game normally, when you hold a team to 30% from beyond the arc, you feel like you've done your job. The Nets do go ice cold in the second half and really in the fourth quarter of this one. But it's something to keep an eye on, because the Chicago Bulls, I looked at my notes here real quick, 7 offensive rebounds in the first quarter, had 11 at the half, so they cleaned it up a little bit. But again, early second chance opportunities for the Chicago Bulls made a bit of a problem. The other piece that I wanted to get to here, and we'll touch on it in a minute, is the supporting cast and really where this team looked to have some success in terms of managing these veteran minutes. So there's a couple of elements here that I want to touch on in that regard. But before we do, I have to tell you about our friends over, as you know, at Rock Auto. We talked about them a lot on this show, and that's because it's an easy solution to one of those problems. You go to this auto parts store, you say, I need X, I'm not entirely sure. He looks it up on the computer, or her, goes into the back, blows some dust off a product, brings it to you, and you just assume it's the right part, it's the right make, it's the right model. And you also assume that you're getting a good deal, or kind of assume that you're getting screwed. If you go over to rockauto.com, you get to do a couple of things: save time, you also get to save money, and you can choose. This is your decision. You want to save 30, 50, or 100% more on the product that you're buying at your local auto parts store, and maybe not fully feeling like you're getting a good deal on it. I recently had to replace the headlight inside of my Honda. I don't know what model that is. I don't know what the wattage is, and I don't know what a good price point is. But I get on the Rock Auto, see everything right there in front of me, search my make, search my model, search my year, and know that I'm getting the best price and the right product for myself. You go ahead over there on to the website, where it's a family-owned business, by the way. Been serving those do-it-yourselfers like you and me for over 20 years. And they also have the reliable prices that you can count on for every single customer. Go over to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts that are available for your car or truck, right locked on in the How Did You Hear About Us box, so that they know that we sent you there. It's amazing selection. It's reliably low prices. All the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So as we get back into this, of course, want to remind everybody we appreciate you making us your first listen of the day. The Locked On Nets podcast, covering your Brooklyn Nets needs. We're free on all the great platforms. And as I said before, it's a two-way street. You really help support us by listening to the show, and we feel like we support you, giving you a healthy dose of Brooklyn Nets content on a daily basis. So, beyond the loss and beyond Kevin Durant and James Harden and feeling good about their games and understanding it was a fatigue factor in here, there's a couple of other elements here that I want to touch on. Bembry's one of the first guys off the bench in this one. Really like that decision. It looks like, as we've been suspicious of on the podcast, that Bembry is working himself into a more and more prominent role. And you're seeing it on both ends of the floor. He got in for a steal, broke out, little flush on the other end there. You also saw, though, on the offensive end, specifically when he came early in this game for Joe Harris, great opportunity to see him set up out in the corner on the wing, gets a pass from Kevin Durant, shows a little hesitation on the up, but then puts the ball on the deck and drives at the basket. Something that he's more athletic. He's quicker off the dribble than Joe Harris. So it gives you a little bit of a different element, and certainly gives you an offensive component that you don't get in Joe Harris, and then you also don't get in a guy like Bruce Brown. So when you think about the different combinations that the Brooklyn Nets can run out there, Bruce Brown is not setting up in the corner for a spot up triple and then taking his man off the dribble, right? We saw this last year from Joe a little bit, drive the baseline, get at the rim. But for the most part, most defenders are going to be able to keep him in front of him. And we know that's not supposed to be the most important part of his game. So I think Bembry is slowly coming along here. And one of the best lineups, I looked this up over on NBA.com. The current second best lineup for the Brooklyn Nets, four-man lineup, is Aldridge, Durant, Patty Mills, and Bembry. And there's a lot of elements to that just seem really obvious, right? I mean, first and foremost is Kevin Durant. Then the state of LMA's game really balanced on both ends of the floor. Patty Mills can be an impact player defensively, can also be explosive on the offensive side, good facilitator as well. And then Bembry, though. And he showcased it on both ends. And what I really like about it is the offensive rating in that lineup is 121. It's the best offensive four-man lineup that the Brooklyn Nets have. The defensive rating is actually fifth best amongst these groups of different four-man lineups that we're talking about. So it's interesting to take a look at the way, and then the overall net rating, by the way, is as I said, second best on the team. And when you get into some of the other numbers here, there's not going to be a lot of big sample sizes for Bembry within these four-man units. He's just starting to ramp up some larger minute shares, but it does bear watching how Bembry can impact both ends of the floor for this team, and maybe how the Nets can start to look to buy some minutes for a couple of the veteran players on this team. The last element that I want to get to is the big game for LaMarcus Aldridge. And then we're going to just kind of touch on some of these stat lines here, though, because inside of this game, you're talking about LMA comes off the bench, third game off the bench, scoring 20 plus points for the Brooklyn Nets. Really came up big for them in this game, carrying some of the load. Had 10 points in the second quarter of this contest, 15 in the first half. Now he ends up finishing with 19 total points, 8 of 13 shooting, Mr. Automatic from the elbow. We get all that. The interesting piece of this, though, too, I think, is to balance it out, the guy we were just glowing about in the last game on a back-to-back, Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin plays 21 minutes, goes 1 of 5, 0 of 4 from beyond the arc, 7 total rebounds, had 4 assists, so did distribute nicely, but just the 2 points. And this is what we've talked about all year long. It's what we talked about last season. This is the balance that the Brooklyn Nets need to strike for themselves over the course of this year. Now, the upside is, as they mentioned on the broadcast, The Brooklyn Nets are, I think they have the fewest back-to-back games this season at just 12, and they've already accomplished one of those with the wrap-up loss tonight against Chicago. So they're not going to have to do it often, but when you think when you think about these players and these teams, you do have to take a step back and remember these guys have mileage on the body. So you're not going to be able to run Blake Griffin for 30 plus minutes a night with consistency. You're also probably not going to be able to look to LaMarcus Aldridge to give you 19-point performances every game of the night. But what you can do is alternate in between them. We know that when Claxton comes back, he'll take away some of that lift on the defensive end, certainly. But this is what you have to look to accomplish: is how do you try to find minutes for LaMarcus Aldridge? I mean, rest minutes throughout a given game, rest minutes for Blake Griffin throughout a game, throughout a stretch of games. And then the last really mystery element here for me is it's the Paul Millsap piece. He's supposed to be a part of this group of guys. It's supposed to be LaMarcus Aldridge, Blake Griffin, Paul Millsap, all inside of the, and and then a little bit of Bruce Brown. We talk about the four-ish, five-ish, this kind of amoeba position that the Brooklyn Nets have. But I think they envisioned Millsap being a fairly consistent player on both ends of the floor. So if you look at the games right now, taking out what would be considered an outlier in the last game for Blake Griffin, where he's exploded a little bit offensively and knocked down some perimeter shots. For the most part, he's been bad. You have a player that's doing really good things for you on the defensive end, not so much on the offensive end. You've got a player in LaMarcus Aldridge who can have a defensive impact, but certainly you love where his offensive game is, especially from a spacing standpoint and what it creates. Paul Millsap, I think, is supposed to be this little blended version of both. Physical like Blake Griffin on the defensive end, capable of knocking down some open looks on the offensive end, and yet we just have not seen it come to fruition yet. And if that's not going to be a part of it, then you start to look at this hierarchy. You start to think back to last year and small ball lineups. And this is where, to tie it all together, Bruce Brown becomes a big factor. Had a bad game tonight. That'll happen. But it's where he becomes a bigger factor. It's where Bembry can become a bigger factor, because now what you're worried about, or not worried about, but the choice that you're making is, how do we stay versatile on the defensive end to impact things there, and then still be effective enough on the offensive end so that it isn't a pure Kevin Durant every single night lift opportunity, right? So as Harden gets healthy, we think there'll be an opportunity for the offense to get a little bit more balance. The problem is now that if Millsap is not going to be a contributor the way the expectations were, and there's still time, we said 15, 20 games sample size you want before you make any concrete ideas about a roster. But if he's not going to be there even for the defensive side of things, now you've got to figure out, how do you maybe use more Nicholas Claxton when he's back for what he gives you defensively, and then mitigate what he doesn't give you offensively. So the Nets are in this weird state of not fully having everything fleshed out just yet, checking some really nice boxes like LaMarcus Aldridge, checking a maybe surprising early season box in Bembry, and now needing to figure out, what are the last couple of elements here that we need to take care of so that we feel like, on a possession to possession basis, from starters to bench, as we blend the rotation and spread out the Kevin Durant and James Harden minutes, that things around them are still going to function properly. Take the Chicago game as a blip on the radar. 5-game win streak overall. Nets looking really strong. We will, of course, come back in, preview the upcoming Wednesday night matchup against the Orlando Magic, a team that, as we said before, is young, is scrappy, and exactly the team you want to see on the schedule when you want to get back to your winning ways. In the meantime, you can, of course, follow us over on Twitter, myself individually, Adam Armbrecht, Doug Norrie, but also the Locked On Nets a Twitter feed where we'll be breaking things down during the course of the games, over on YouTube, where we have seen absolutely just a massive level of support from everybody. So we really do appreciate it. We saw the subscription numbers really taking a big jump up, the views on our last video, everyone getting involved, the comments, just fantastic interaction. So we continue to appreciate it. We try to be as active and as responsive as we possibly can over there. So be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and, of course, to the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled. And we continue to remind you that when you do those things, it's 100% free. And we appreciate you making us your first listen, your first watch of every single day. We continue to be happy to provide the kind of Brooklyn Nets content that we think you're all going to love and enjoy. We'll be back in talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. No quote today other than to say, Doug Norrie, where are you? Return to me, my friend. We'll be back again talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.